The morning sun peeked through the curtains of Harold Thompson's bedroom, casting warm strips of light across his carefully made bed. At exactly 6:30 a.m., the old alarm clock rang with its familiar ding, though Harold had been awake for the past 30 minutes. Old habits from his military days never really went away, even at the age of 93. Harold sat up slowly in his bed, his joints creaking like an old wooden door. But his eyes, bright blue and alert, showed the spark of a much younger man. On his bedside table, next to a black and white photograph of his late wife Martha, lay his 3 war medals, polished to perfection the night before. The old veteran's morning routine never changed. First, he would shuffle to his bathroom, where his shaving kit waited in perfect order, razor, brush, and cream lined up like soldiers on parade. His hands might have become a bit shaky over the years, but he still managed to give himself a clean shave every morning. "A gentleman always looks his best," Martha used to say, and Harold lived by those words. After his shower, Harold carefully dressed himself in his favorite outfit, pressed khaki pants, a light blue button-down shirt, and his worn but well-polished brown leather shoes. He pinned his medals to his shirt pocket with careful precision, each one telling a story of bravery from his days in World War II. The small house on Pine Street had been his home for the past 50 years. Every room held memories, from the scratches on the kitchen doorframe, where he had marked his children's heights, to the slightly worn armchair where he still sat every evening to read the newspaper. The house was simple but spotless. Harold believed in keeping things clean and organized, just like in the military. At 7:45 a.m., Harold began his walk to Linda's Diner, 3 blocks away. He used a wooden cane now, one he had carved himself in his small woodworking shop behind the house. The morning air was crisp, and he nodded hello to Mrs. Rodriguez, who was watering her flowers next door. She had been his neighbor for 20 years, and often brought him homemade tamales on Sundays. The walk took him past familiar sights, the small grocery store where the owner's son always waved at him, the park where he sometimes sat to watch children play, and finally, the red brick building that housed Linda's Diner. The bell above the door chimed as Harold pushed it open at exactly 8 o'clock a.m., just as it had every Monday morning for the past 30 years. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson." Sarah's cheerful voice greeted him. The young waitress, with her red hair tied back in a neat ponytail, had been working at the diner for 5 years now. She reminded Harold of his granddaughter Jenny, who lived in California with her family. Sarah already had his regular table ready, the second one from the window, where he could watch both the street outside and the whole diner inside. "Morning, Sarah," Harold replied with a gentle smile, easing himself into his usual seat. The vinyl cushion had a small dip in it from years of him sitting in the exact same spot. Without having to ask, Sarah brought him his first cup of black coffee, steam rising from the white ceramic mug like morning fog over a battlefield. The other regular customers nodded respectfully as they passed his table. Everyone knew Harold Thompson, the old veteran who never missed his Monday morning breakfast of black coffee and blueberry pancakes. Some of the younger customers would sometimes stop to ask about his medals, and Harold would tell them simple stories about friendship and courage, carefully leaving out the harsher details of war. As he waited for his pancakes, Harold looked around the diner with contentment. The walls were decorated with old photographs of the town, including one from 1946 that showed him and Martha at the diner's grand opening. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, mixed with the quiet murmur of conversation and the gentle clink of plates and cups. This was his routine, his small piece of paradise in a world that had changed so much around him. Harold Thompson might have been 93 years old, but in this diner, surrounded by familiar faces and memories, he felt timeless. Little did he know that this peaceful Monday morning routine was about to face an unexpected disruption that would change everything. The peaceful morning at Linda's Diner shattered like broken glass when the deep rumble of motorcycle engines filled the air. Harold paused, his fork halfway to his mouth, blueberry syrup dripping slowly back onto his half-eaten pancakes. Outside the diner's large window, 5 massive motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their chrome parts gleaming in the morning sun. Sarah, who had been refilling Harold's coffee cup, stopped mid-pour. "Oh dear," she whispered, watching as the bikers dismounted their machines. Each man stood over 6 feet tall, their bodies covered in leather jackets despite the warm morning. Their boots made heavy sounds against the pavement as they approached the diner's entrance. The bell above the door, which had chimed so pleasantly for Harold earlier, now seemed to ring with a warning tone, The bikers entered one by one, their leather jackets creaking as they moved. The leader walked in first, a mountain of a man with a thick black beard streaked with gray and arms covered in colorful tattoos. A patch on his jacket read Tank. Behind him came four others, each looking as tough as the leader. The usual morning chatter in the diner died down to whispers, then to silence. The only sounds were the sizzling of bacon on the grill and the heavy thud of the bikers' boots on the checkered floor. They headed straight for the corner booth next to Harold's table, their chains jingling with each step. Tank slid into the booth first, the vinyl seat groaning under his weight. His eyes scanned the diner like a predator surveying its territory. The other bikers followed, a skinny man with a snake tattoo on his neck, twin brothers with matching skull bandanas, and a younger man whose jacket was covered in patches. "Coffee, all around," Tank commanded, his voice as rough as gravel. "And make it strong." Sarah hurried to comply, her hands slightly shaking as she gathered 5 mugs. The cook, Pete, peeked out from the kitchen window, his usual cheerful expression replaced with concern. The bikers didn't bother opening their menus. Instead, they started talking loudly about their recent road trip, using language that made several nearby customers wince. An elderly couple at the counter quickly paid their bill and left, casting nervous glances over their shoulders. Harold continued eating his pancakes, maintaining his dignified composure, but he couldn't help noticing how the bikers kept looking at him, particularly at the medals on his shirt. Their voices grew louder, seemingly on purpose. "Hey, look at those shiny pins," the skinny one said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Must be from the Stone Age or something." Tank leaned back in his booth, his leather jacket creaking. "Yeah, probably got them for winning a shuffleboard tournament at the old folks' home." His companions laughed, the sound harsh and mocking in the quiet diner. Sarah returned with their coffee, placing the mugs down carefully. "Would you gentlemen like to order some food?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Bring us everything on the breakfast special," Tank said, not bothering to look at her. His eyes were fixed on Harold's medals. "And some entertainment while we wait." He nudged one of the twin brothers, who stood up and deliberately bumped into Harold's table. Coffee sloshed over the rim of Harold's cup, creating a brown puddle that began to spread across the white tablecloth. Several other customers watched in horror, but nobody dared to speak up. The morning sun that had seemed so pleasant earlier now felt harsh and revealing through the diner's windows. The biker didn't apologize. Instead, he smirked and returned to his seat, exchanging high fives with his companions. They continued their loud conversation, now mixing in comments about retirement home soldiers and Grandpa's story time. The atmosphere in Linda's diner had transformed completely. The warm, friendly morning had turned cold and tense. Regular customers who usually chatted freely now spoke in whispers, if at all. Sarah stood behind the counter, worriedly watching the scene unfold. Pete had stopped cooking, his spatula held tight in his hand as he watched through the kitchen window. Harold sat straight in his chair, his weathered hands resting calmly on the table despite the coffee stains spreading toward his plate. His face remained composed, but something flickered in his blue eyes. Not fear, but something else entirely. The bikers had no idea that they had just challenged a man who had faced much worse than leather-clad bullies in his 93 years of life. Tank watched Harold with growing interest, like a cat toying with its prey. The old veteran's calm demeanor seemed to irritate the biker leader more than any angry response would have. Wiping his beard with the back of his hand, Tank stood up, his massive frame casting a shadow across Harold's table. "Those are some interesting medals you got there, old-timer," Tank said, his voice carrying across the now silent diner. "Mind telling us what they're for? Baking the best cookies in the retirement home?" His gang burst into laughter, the sound echoing off the diner's walls. Harold slowly put down his coffee cup, his movements deliberate and controlled. The morning sun streaming through the window caught the medals on his chest, making them shine. One was a Purple Heart, another a Bronze Star, and the third a Distinguished Service Cross, though the bikers were too ignorant of military honors to recognize their significance. "You boys seem very interested in history," Harold said quietly, his voice steady. "Perhaps you'd like to learn something about these medals." His tone wasn't challenging or angry, just matter of fact, which seemed to confuse Tank momentarily. The skinny biker with the snake tattoo stepped forward. "Look at this guy, Tank. Thinks he's going to give us a history lesson." He reached out and flicked one of Harold's medals with his finger. Probably bought these at a yard sale. Sarah started forward from behind the counter, her face flushed with anger. That's enough. You can't treat Mr. Thompson like this. He's a... It's all right, Sarah. Harold interrupted gently, raising his hand. These young men are just curious. His calm response seemed to frustrate the bikers even more. They were used to people either fighting back or running away scared, not this quiet confidence. Tank leaned down, placing his hands on Harold's table. His leather jacket creaked as he moved, and the chains on his pants jingled. You know what I think? He growled. I think you're just another old man living in the past, wearing medals to feel important. The twin brothers moved to either side of Tank, crossing their arms and trying to look intimidating. The younger biker hummed back, looking slightly uncomfortable with how things were escalating, but too afraid of Tank to speak up. Harold's eyes met Tank's, and for a moment, something in those aged blue eyes made the biker leader blink. They weren't the eyes of a frightened old man. They were the eyes of someone who had seen things that would haunt Tank's nightmares. Son, Harold said softly, those who make the loudest noise often know the least about real courage. His words weren't spoken as an insult, but as if he were sharing a simple truth. Tank's face reddened. He straightened up and deliberately knocked Harold's plate off the table. It crashed to the floor, sending pieces of pancake and ceramic scattering across the checkered tiles. Several customers gasped, and Pete the cook emerged from the kitchen, holding his spatula like a weapon. The diner had become so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Sarah had tears in her eyes, but Harold's expression remained unchanged. He looked at the broken plate on the floor, then back at Tank, with something like pity in his gaze. You know what's funny, old man? Tank sneered, trying to hide his unease at Harold's steady gaze. In all my years riding, I'd never met anyone who actually fought in World War II. Probably because they're all too busy telling fake stories in diners like this. That's when Harold did something unexpected. He reached into his wallet and pulled out an old, worn photograph. The edges were yellowed with age, but the image was clear, a young soldier standing next to a military motorcycle, his face bearing an unmistakable resemblance to Harold. Perhaps, Harold said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel, it's time you learned about real motorcycles, son, and real courage. He placed the photograph on the table, and despite themselves, the bikers leaned in to look. The morning sun continued to stream through the diner's windows, illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage. No one in Linda's diner that morning could have guessed what would happen next, least of all Tank and his gang of would-be intimidators. The photograph on the table seemed to cast a spell over the diner. Tank and his gang stared at the image of young Harold, their tough expressions softening with confusion. In the picture, Harold stood proud and tall beside a military-issue Harley-Davidson Dual LA motorcycle, wearing the uniform of the 101st Airborne Division. The motorcycle's sides were covered with combat gear, and a Thompson submachine gun was mounted on the handlebars. That bike, the younger biker whispered, breaking the silence. That's a 1942 Harley Davidson. They only made those for the military during World War II. His voice carried a tone of respect that made Tank shoot him an angry look. Harold nodded, his weathered hand smoothing out the photograph's corners. This was taken in England, just before D-Day, he said quietly. I was part of a special motorcycle reconnaissance unit. We would ride ahead of the main forces, gathering intelligence about enemy positions. The skinny biker with the snake tattoo leaned closer, his earlier mockery forgotten. D-Day, you mean you were actually there? June 6, 1944, Harold replied, his blue eyes growing distant with memory. I rode that motorcycle through France, Holland, and eventually into Germany. We carried messages when radio silence was necessary, scouted enemy positions, and sometimes had to fight our way out of tight spots. What the bikers didn't know was that Harold's experience went far beyond just riding motorcycles in the war. After his reconnaissance duties, he had been selected for special combat training. His commanding officers had noticed his quick thinking and calm demeanor under pressure, making him an ideal candidate for teaching hand-to-hand combat to other soldiers. Even now, at 93, Harold's hands remained strong from years of working in his woodshop. Every morning, despite his age, he still did modified versions of the exercises he had taught to soldiers decades ago. His neighbors often saw him in his backyard, practicing slow, deliberate movements that they assumed were just an old man's exercise routine. They didn't realize they were watching a former combat instructor maintaining skills that had once saved his life. Tank shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado diminishing as he noticed the way Harold's eyes tracked every movement in the room. It was the instinctive awareness of someone who had survived real danger, not just bar fights and road rage incidents. After the war, Harold continued, pulling out another photograph. I trained other soldiers in hand-to-hand combat at Fort Benning. Taught them how to handle themselves in close quarters, how to stay calm when everything around them was chaos. His voice remained gentle, but there was an underlying strength that made even Tank take a small step back. Sarah, still standing behind the counter, smiled knowingly. She had heard parts of Harold's story over the years, but had never shared them with customers. She knew about the medals in his display case at home, not just the ones he wore, but dozens more that told the story of a true hero. The twin brothers exchanged glances, their tough guy act falling away as they realized they had badly misjudged the situation. The younger biker was now openly staring at Harold with admiration, ignoring Tank's disapproving glare. Harold's woodshop, which the bikers had probably imagined as a retiree's hobby room, was actually a well-maintained workspace where he still spent hours each day. The physical labor kept his hands strong and his mind sharp. The walking cane he carried was one he had carved himself, not out of necessity, but as a reminder of the walking stick he had used during his combat training days. You see, boys, Harold said, looking each biker in the eye, these medals aren't about living in the past. They're reminders that strength isn't about making noise or scaring people. Real strength is about knowing when to fight and, more importantly, when not to. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, and its light now fell directly on Harold's medals, making them shine with an almost magical brilliance. The diner remained silent, but it was no longer the tense silence of fear. Instead, it was the quiet of respect, of people realizing they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. Tank stood frozen, his earlier confidence shattered, as he began to understand that he had unknowingly challenged someone who had faced and survived challenges he couldn't imagine. The next few moments would prove crucial in determining how this confrontation would end. The atmosphere in Linda's diner hung heavy like storm clouds before rain. Regular customers who had come for their morning coffee found themselves witnessing something extraordinary. Some had already quietly slipped out, while others remained frozen in their seats, watching the scene unfold between the elderly veteran and the group of bikers. Sarah stood behind the counter, her hands gripping a coffee pot so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She had known Harold for 5 years, served him countless cups of coffee, but had never seen him quite like this. Though he remained seated, there was something about his presence that now filled the entire diner. Tank paced back and forth, his heavy boots making the floor creak. The tough biker leader found himself in unfamiliar territory. Usually, his size and reputation were enough to intimidate anyone, but Harold's calm demeanor and war stories had changed the dynamic completely. Tank's gang watched their leader, waiting to see what he would do next. So you rode motorcycles in the war, Tank finally said, trying to regain control of the situation. That was a long time ago, old man. Things are different now. But his voice lacked its earlier confidence, and everyone in the diner could hear it. Harold slowly stood up from his chair. Despite his age, his movements were surprisingly smooth and controlled. His cane, which now rested against the table, seemed more like a prop than a necessity. You're right about one thing, he said quietly. It was a long time ago, but some things don't change with time, like respect, honor, and the difference between real strength and just making noise. The younger biker, who had been studying the old photographs, suddenly spoke up. Tank, maybe we should. Shut up. Tank snapped, but his outburst seemed desperate rather than threatening. The twin brothers shifted uncomfortably, no longer looking as intimidating as they had when they first entered the diner. The skinny biker with the snake tattoo had backed away slightly, his eyes darting between Harold and the door. Pete, the cook, had come out from his kitchen. He now stood near the counter, still holding his spatula, but his worried expression had been replaced by one of growing admiration for Harold. Other customers in the diner had begun to whisper among themselves, some taking out their phones to record what was happening. Harold took one step forward, his blue eyes fixed on Tank. In that moment, everyone could see the soldier he had once been, the young man who had ridden his motorcycle through war-torn Europe, who had trained others in combat, who had faced real danger and survived. His aged frame carried a dignity that made Tank's leather jacket and tough guy attitude seem almost childish in comparison. "Let me tell you something about motorcycles," Harold said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent diner. "During the war, we didn't ride them to intimidate people or make them afraid. We rode them because we had a job to do, a purpose greater than ourselves. Each bike had to be maintained perfectly. One loose bolt could mean the difference between completing your mission and not coming back at all." Tank's face reddened, but he seemed unable to move or respond. The morning sun through the windows cast long shadows across the diner's floor, making the scene look almost like a painting. The standing veteran, the uncertain bikers, the watching crowd. Sarah had tears in her eyes, but they were tears of pride now, not fear. She had served coffee to a hero all these years, never knowing the full extent of his story. Pete nodded slowly from his position near the counter, a small smile forming on his face as he watched Harold command the room without raising his voice or making a single threat. The tension in the diner had transformed into something else, a kind of electric anticipation. Everyone present knew they were witnessing something special, a moment when true strength confronted false bravado, when wisdom faced off against arrogance. Harold's next words would either diffuse the situation or cause it to explode. He reached for his cane, not for support, but almost as if it were a conductor's baton, and he was about to lead an orchestra in an important performance. The medals on his chest caught the sunlight one more time, and in their gleam, everyone could see that this confrontation was about to take an unexpected turn. What Harold did next surprised everyone in Linda's diner. Instead of confronting Tank and his gang with anger, he slowly pulled out an empty chair from his table. With a gentle motion of his hand, he gestured for Tank to sit down. The invitation was so unexpected that Tank found himself sitting before he even realized what he was doing. "Let me show you something else," Harold said, his voice warm and friendly as he reached into his worn leather wallet. He pulled out another photograph, this one more faded than the others. The picture showed a group of young soldiers sitting on their motorcycles, all of them smiling despite their dirty uniforms and tired faces. "This was my unit," Harold explained, placing the photo carefully on the table. "We called ourselves the Ghost Riders because we could slip behind enemy lines without being noticed. See this man here?" He pointed to a tough-looking soldier with a beard. "That's Jimmy Martinez. He rode the loudest Harley in the unit, but he had the gentlest heart. Saved my life twice." The younger biker moved closer, fascination overcoming his fear. Harold nodded encouragingly, and soon all 5 bikers had gathered around the table, their earlier hostility forgotten as they leaned in to see the photograph. The other customers in the diner watched in amazement as the scene transformed from confrontation to conversation. "We weren't so different from you boys," Harold continued, his blue eyes twinkling. "Young men who loved motorcycles, looking for adventure, wanting to prove ourselves. We learned something important during those dark days in Europe. Real brotherhood isn't about intimidation. It's about standing together, protecting each other, and doing what's right." Tank's tough expression had completely disappeared. He stared at the photographs, then at his own reflection in the diner's window, seeing himself in a new light. "My grandfather," he said suddenly, his voice unusually quiet. "He was in Vietnam. Never talked about it much before he passed away." Harold nodded understandingly. "Many don't talk about it. But maybe that's part of the problem. We keep our stories inside, and the younger generations miss out on learning from them." He pulled out another photograph, this one showing him teaching hand-to-hand combat to young soldiers. "After the war," Harold explained, "I taught soldiers how to defend themselves. But the most important lesson wasn't about fighting. It was about knowing when not to fight. About understanding that true strength comes from here." He tapped his heart. "And here," he touched his temple. Sarah quietly brought fresh coffee for everyone, moving around the table like she was serving a family gathering rather than a group that had been on the verge of conflict minutes earlier. The morning sun now filled the diner with a warm, golden light, as if nature itself approved of the peaceful turn of events. The skinny biker with the snake tattoo cleared his throat. "Those bikes you rode in the war, they were special models, right? Military issue?" His genuine interest made Harold smile. "Indeed they were. Each one had its own personality, just like your bikes do. We had to know every inch of them, maintain them perfectly. Lives depended on it." Harold's words painted pictures of midnight missions, secret messages delivered under enemy fire, and the unbreakable bond between riders who depended on each other for survival. The twin brothers, who had been quietly listening, exchanged glances. One of them spoke up. "Our dad has some old military bikes in his garage. Never knew much about their history." As Harold shared more stories, the atmosphere in the diner continued to change. Other customers who had been afraid now smiled at the scene before them. Pete the cook returned to his kitchen, the tension in his shoulders gone. The sound of gentle conversation and occasional laughter replaced the earlier hostile silence. The most remarkable transformation was in Tank himself. The angry, intimidating biker leader had been replaced by an attentive listener, his eyes fixed on Harold's photographs, his questions becoming more thoughtful and respectful. It was as if Harold's gentle response had broken through a lifetime of built-up anger and revealed the person beneath the tough exterior. The morning had stretched into early afternoon at Linda's diner, but nobody seemed to notice the time passing. The plates of half-eaten breakfast food lay forgotten on the table as Harold continued sharing his stories. The transformation in the bikers was remarkable to watch, like seeing ice melt under a warm sun. Tank, who had entered the diner as an intimidating figure, now sat with his leather jacket unzipped, his posture relaxed and open. His eyes grew misty as he finally opened up about his own grandfather. "He died 3 years ago," Tank said, his voice rough with emotion. "I always wanted to know about his time in Vietnam, but he never talked about it. I guess that's why your stories hit me so hard, sir." The word "sir" came naturally now, replacing the mocking tone from earlier. Harold reached across the table and patted Tank's arm, a gesture that would have been unthinkable an hour ago. "Sometimes," Harold said gently, "the bravest men are the quietest about their courage. Your grandfather carried his memories like I carry mine, some too heavy to share." The younger biker, whose name was Mike, had pulled his chair closer to Harold's. His enthusiasm for motorcycle history bubbled over as Harold described the technical details of his old military Harley. The Bullied had a 45 cubic inch engine, Mike explained to his fellow bikers, and they were called the Liberator by the troops who used them. "That's right," Harold smiled, pleased by Mike's knowledge. Though we cared less about the specifications and more about whether they would get us home alive. Each bike had its own quirks, you had to know them like you'd know a friend's personality. The skinny biker with the snake tattoo, who introduced himself as Ray, pulled out his phone and showed Harold pictures of his own motorcycle collection. "I've been trying to restore a 1947 Harley," he said. "It's been giving me trouble, though. Why don't you bring it by my workshop?" Harold offered. "I may be old, but these hands still remember every part of those engines." He held up his weathered hands, and everyone could see they were the hands of someone who had worked with machines all his life. The twin brothers, Tom and Tim, shared glances again, but this time with excitement rather than menace. "Our motorcycle club has a memorial ride coming up next month," Tom said. "It's to honor veterans. Would you consider being our guest of honor?" Sarah, who had been quietly watching this transformation while serving other customers, couldn't hide her smile. She had never seen anything quite like it. The morning's potential violence had turned into something beautiful, something healing. Tank straightened in his chair, seeming to make a decision. "Mr. Thompson," he said formally, "I need to apologize for how we acted earlier. We were—" He struggled for words. "We were being exactly what we hate in others. Judgmental, disrespectful." Harold waved off the apology with a gentle hand. "The past is the past, son. What matters is what we learn from it and how we move forward." He pulled out one more photograph from his wallet, this one showing him with his motorcycle unit receiving the commendation. "You know what made our unit special? Not the bikes, not the missions, but the fact that we looked out for each other. Real riders understand that." The other customers in the diner had become part of the moment, some wiping away tears as they watched the scene unfold. Pete emerged from the kitchen with a fresh pot of coffee and a plate of his special apple pie, offering it to the group with a warm smile. As the afternoon sun filtered through the diner's windows, the change in the atmosphere was complete. The biker's tough exterior had melted away, revealing the decent men who had been hiding behind those intimidating facades. They leaned forward, eagerly asking questions about Harold's experiences, sharing their own stories, and building bridges across the generations. The transformation wasn't just in the bikers' attitude toward Harold, it was in how they saw themselves. Through Harold's stories and wisdom, they had glimpsed a different kind of strength, a different kind of brotherhood, and it had changed them in ways they were only beginning to understand. 6 months had passed since that remarkable morning at Linda's diner, and everything had changed. What began as a confrontation had blossomed into something nobody could have predicted. The diner itself had become a different place, especially on Sunday mornings when the rumble of motorcycles would announce the arrival of some very special visitors. Harold still came for his regular Monday breakfast, but now his table was rarely empty. More often than not, Tank and his riders would stop by, eager to hear more stories and share their own adventures. The corner booth that had once been a place of tension had become known as the Veterans' Corner, where riders young and old would gather to talk about motorcycles, life, and the bonds that united them across generations. Tank had undergone the most striking transformation. The tough biker leader had discovered a new purpose in life. With Harold's guidance, he had started a program called Riders Remember, which paired motorcycle enthusiasts with veterans in the community. Every weekend, bikers would visit veterans' homes, helping with repairs, listening to their stories, or simply providing companionship. You see, Harold would say to anyone who would listen, sometimes the worst moments in life can lead to the best changes, if we're wise enough to learn from them. The young biker, Mike, had become Harold's unofficial apprentice in the woodshop. 3 days a week, he would come over to learn not just about woodworking, but about life, courage, and what it meant to be a real leader. Under Harold's patient guidance, Mike had started crafting custom wooden plaques for veteran ceremonies, each one telling a story of service and sacrifice. Ray, the skinny biker with the snake tattoo, had finally restored his 1947 Harley with Harold's help. The process had taken months, with Harold sharing not just mechanical knowledge, but the stories behind each part they fixed. The bike now held a special place in their memorial rides, representing the bridge between past and present. The twin brothers, Tom and Tim, had transformed their motorcycle club's image in the community. Instead of being seen as troublemakers, they became known for organizing veteran support rides and charity events. Their leather jackets now proudly displayed a new patch, a Ghost Rider logo inspired by Harold's old unit, with the words, "Honor, Respect, Remember" circling it. Sarah, the waitress, watched all of this with joy. Linda's Diner had become more than just a restaurant. It was a place where barriers between generations dissolved over cups of coffee and shared stories. She had even started a wall of photographs near Harold's regular table, documenting the growing friendship between the old veteran and his unlikely new family of bikers. Pete, the cook, had created a special menu item called the Veterans' Breakfast, the same blueberry pancakes and coffee that Harold had been eating all those years. A portion of its price went to the local Veterans Support Fund, and it had become the diner's most popular dish. On Harold's 94th birthday, the parking lot of Linda's Diner was filled with motorcycles. Riders from across the state had come to celebrate with him. Tank had organized everything, making sure every detail was perfect. The highlight of the party was when they presented Harold with a customized sidecar for his wheelchair, allowing him to ride safely alongside them during their memorial events. Life has a funny way of teaching us lessons, Harold said during his birthday speech, his blue eyes twinkling with happiness. Sometimes the best friends come from the most unexpected places, and the worst beginnings can lead to the most beautiful endings. The story of the 93-year-old veteran and the bikers who tried to bully him became a legend in their small town, but not for the reasons anyone would have expected. It wasn't a story about conflict or confrontation, but about transformation, understanding, and the power of wisdom over force. Every Monday morning, like clockwork, Harold still polished his medals and walked to the diner. But now, his slow steps were often accompanied by the gentle rumble of motorcycles, their riders serving as an honor guard for a man who had taught them that true strength comes not from intimidation, but from the courage to turn enemies into friends. And in Linda's Diner, where it all began, the morning sun still streamed through the windows, illuminating a scene that proved it's never too late for new beginnings, and that sometimes the most powerful response to hostility is not a raised fist, but an open heart.